Welcome to Syntax. Today we have a really special guest, a type of developer we have not talked to before. In fact, a typographer developer. We're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of designing typefaces, typography on the web, all sorts of cool stuff. So with us today is Stephen Nixon. He's the owner of a type foundry, ArrowType. And we're going to be picking Stephen's brain about all things typography in the web, getting deep into variable fonts. So, Stephen, what's up?
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. It's really exciting to be here.
Yeah. Stephen and I talk on IG sometimes, and I've been following his typefaces and his font progress on there and all sorts of different typography information. So I was really stoked when you had mentioned me in a comment, Stephen, that you were aware of Syntax.
Long time lurker. Yep.
Yeah. So let's get into it. First and foremost, what's your background? How did you get into type? How did you get into type design?
There's kind of the 5-year history and there's the 30-year history, I guess. I don't know. I've always been really attracted to drawing letters and logos and kind of geometric problems, I guess, kind of click nicely in my brain. So to give the 30-year history, growing up in school, I had a lot of friends who were very interested in football teams and stuff. And that was in South Dakota, which is next to Colorado. So obviously the Denver Broncos have the coolest logo in the league. And I didn't really understand football, but I liked to try to draw logos. And then getting up more into high school, I got into playing electric bass and some bands. So I was drawing flyers by hand and trying to copy those and hand them out. And then I found out that graphic design was a trade and a job that people actually had, which kind of blew my mind. But I ended up going to school for that at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. And there, I realized that there were living font designers, which also, again, another thing that blew my mind. We had a project to look into a historical font and a new font. And I was like, hold up, new fonts? You mean Helvetica or something? And no, it turns out I Googled Twin Cities type designers and Eric Olson of Process Type came up, and he's a Minneapolis-based font designer who's living and working and continuing to release really amazing projects. And there's also Mark Simonson in St. Paul. You may know Proxima Nova. I feel like the general public knowledge of fonts has exploded in the last 15 years as well. But yeah, back then, I was really lucky to go and meet Eric Olson, and I kind of brought a little podcast recording setup because I was kind of obsessed with podcasts back then too. And I just asked him all of the silliest, most basic beginner questions. And he was so patient and wonderful and responding and kind of walking me through what fonts are, what type design is, why he is actually making new fonts, and why anybody would want a new font, and how his latest release at that point was not actually, in fact, just similar to Helvetica. And I try to remind myself and remember that, because I think that it's really hard once you're really deep in the weeds of something to realize that an outsider doesn't see all of the differences that you do. You literally, your brain and your eyes completely change in how you can perceive the things you're interested in. And so that's actually kind of a constant gap, when you're a web developer or a visual designer or a UX designer or a font designer, that I think it's useful to remember, just in how you communicate. After graphic design major in college, I was really lucky to get a job at IBM as a visual designer for software. I worked there for a couple of years, moved into a brand side on IBM Watson at the time. And the whole time I was drawing lots of lettering on the side, because I still had this real passion for drawing letters, even though I was also interested in web development and UX and UI design. Another revelation actually was that I realized that in The Hague, in the Netherlands, there is a master's degree program for type design where 11 or 12 students go every year and learn from some of the best type designers in the world there in The Hague. How to make fonts. And so as soon as I learned about that, I was I got to do that someday.
Wow,
I would love to do that, but I don't know if it's kind of it felt like joining the major leagues or something, where at one side it was really exciting that it was a thing that you could do, but on the other side, I didn't know if I had it in me. But luckily they were intrigued by my explorations into type and tech, and invited me to join. So I did that. And then kind of after that, I was able to transition into more of a full-time job making fonts.
Wow, that's amazing. I hope you're ready to answer some basic and silly questions about
perfect. Yeah, I'd love
typography
to.
today. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely have some basic questions, because I mean, I'm mostly a dev with like light design.
Sure.
Most of what I know is like font pairings and how to choose one.
I'm still trying to figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
But going back to what Scott mentioned at the beginning, he mentioned you're the owner of a Type Foundry. So what is a Type Foundry, or what is Type Foundry? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, thanks. The Type Foundry business is a little bit like maybe the music business or the photography business. There's kind of two main tracks of making products and selling them. So if you're a musician, for instance, you might make albums and sell those to people. Maybe you have a Bandcamp where people buy your album if you're lucky or whatnot. Maybe you're streaming via Spotify, but maybe you also make money from companies coming to you and saying like, hey, we need a track for our car commercial that rocks really hard. So like, can you help us compose that? So you've kind of got those different avenues of making money. There's kind of the original content that you sell and license to people to use, maybe for themselves. And then there's a more custom content route. And so you can imagine how that would apply to photography as well. Maybe you're selling photos in a gallery, or maybe you're commissioned to make photos for commercials and brands and things. So type is kind of similar to that. The avenue of making retail fonts, as we call it, is creating original content that people will license to use for their business, large or small. And then some companies will come to type designers to say like, hey, we're looking for something very specific for our brand, and we'd like you to help us make it. Maybe an agency has come up with like a really cool idea for a logo or a word mark, but they need some help in refining it into something that really is solid and like really well spaced and considered. And maybe they want to, expand that into a full-on typeface that they can use across their channels and products and interfaces and things.
Wow. That's awesome.
So like type is in a really cool place in the last 10 years, in that like tools for making fonts have gotten quite good, and really like on the development side, they've gotten a lot better too, which I've been particularly interested in. And that's kind of led to a lot of like even just one person type foundries like myself. A lot of the time it's like a side gig for people. Some of the time it can be the full-time thing. And then there's a few font foundries who are definitely bigger, and then a few kind of, for the type industry, colossal players as well.
Nice. So for you, your Type Foundry is literally ArrowType.com?
Yep.
Yeah. Initially, I was Googling like, where is Type Foundry? How do I find it? But
I
guess for you, it's ArrowType.com is your Type Foundry. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Like the pointy directional character, arrow.
Yeah.
Not the aerodynamic kind of.
Oh, yeah.
Arrow,
yeah, like aerospace. So. Yeah, I first became aware of ArrowType from Future Fonts, actually. Future Fonts is kind of like, for me, the place where I learned that there's this whole world of like indie font creators making really cool, interesting typefaces. In fact, it was the MDIO is the font that we use for our brand on Syntax. So that's where we first found that. And awesome. I actually found ArrowType through my buddy at Good Hertz. They use the Wolfpack fonts and all that stuff. Yeah. They do a lot of cool type work over there. So okay, let's get into like font making itself. You mentioned that the tools are getting a lot better. Like technically, how do you make a font? You just throw open an application and go to town with the pen tool?
Yes, in a way, that is definitely a big part of it. I think early on, I had imagined that like, you'd probably just boot up Creative Cloud, download the Adobe font making app, and then make it there. Probably because there's not a very big market for making fonts. Adobe doesn't have a font making app. And so what do you use? There are different font editors, as we call them. The big ones that I've used are RoboFont and Glyphs. Glyphs app is kind of sort of like Sketch if you've used that. It's Mac only, but it's really nice, super fast to work with, allows some like really high quality stuff. And yeah, so that's kind of the thing I use most to draw the fonts. And for web developers, you've probably worked with SVG, of course, like most web developers have some familiarity with what's happening under the hood there. If you've ever like literally kind of moved points around or curves around in an SVG, drawing a glyph in a font, like a shape in a font, is so similar to that because we're using usually cubic Bezier curves to draw. There's a whole theory to like you draw the on curve points and then between them you draw what are called off curve points, and those kind of provide tension to the path to make it a curve. So it's just a pen tool, similar to Illustrator or Photoshop, or Keynote has a basic pen tool even. But yeah, font editors give you a couple of extra options that make the pen tool really nice to use for drawing letters.
Okay. So the I know my experience with the pen tool is in the past it's been a little bit of struggle, but
definitely
once you learn some of the little tips and tricks about where to put the points on a curve, it can get a little easier. In fact, I just made the Canon Films logo into the Syntax logo the other day as a pen tool exercise. I was like, I have to do this.
Like the Canon photography logo?
Oh, no, the Canon Group Films is the film production group that they produced like a whole bunch of B movies from the 80s, and they were famous for drawing up a poster for what the movie would be without having a script or anything. They just make a poster and then sell it based on the poster, and then have to make the movie in a couple months.
Canon Groups has a cool logo. Yeah. Kind of looks like an ArrowType logo almost.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's fun to twist logos.
So how many I know there's a distinction between a typeface and a font, but how many fonts have you made? Like a font is the actual installable thing.
Yeah, exactly. In day-to-day conversation, it doesn't really matter for the most part if you say font or typeface. I'd say that most type designers in casual conversation would probably often say that they're designing a font or a typeface. A typeface is sort of the abstract notion of a work that might contain many things. So it's like an album or a book maybe. And then a font is the individual, like literal technical file that contains information from a typeface. Traditionally, a font was a single style, like bold italic or hairline, whatever. Today, there are variable fonts which can contain many styles within a single file. And so that's kind of a fun concept that's been something I focused on a lot. And I forget what your actual question was.
Oh, it was just like, how many have you made, really? I'm just curious, like, because I'm sure it's a big undertaking to even make one.
Right, yeah. I mean, the fun thing about variable fonts is that because they contain multiple styles within one, you can do what's called interpolation if you've set it up in a certain way, where the user can select exactly the weight they want between, say, regular and bold, if the font includes that axis, stylistic range. Or there's like other variable axes you can put into a variable font, like width is a common one, but every font kind of approaches what axis it has, like according to the goals of that particular typeface. What I'm saying is that since I've made several variable fonts, I could tell you I've made infinite fonts, and that there's many ranges. But really, I've made 2 kind of bigger open source projects, 5 original retail projects that I sell through ArrowType. I've helped other foundries release or kind of do the QA building process of their fonts. So I guess many is the answer.
Yeah.
Nice. You touched on variable fonts. Can you talk about like technically how as a web developer we would use them? Because I've only recently stumbled across them. Like we have MDIO on the Syntax website, and I believe by default we have like all the font files. We have regular, we have bold, we have italic, and then there's a bunch of them. But when I was using Figma, there were some design files that say like you need the variable file. So technically, how do we use it, and how do they relate?
And to be clear, CJ, on top of that, we are only loading the variable. The other ones are just kind of there along for the ride for some reason.
I should look at your style sheet. I love that you're using MDIO, by the way. Mass Driver is super cool. Done some really great projects and just has such a good eye for design. I know I think he comes from a development background, but yeah, fantastic. Very, very smart guy. Yeah, so variablefonts.io is a website that talks about using variable fonts. So that's got lots of like examples and practical tips that are arranged pretty thoughtfully in a way that is probably a little easier to follow than a podcast, but I can definitely touch on some highlights. Yeah, I mean, the basic reason that variable fonts really exist is, or at least a big reason, is that you can include multiple styles in one file, and a font tends to have other information sort of along for the ride to make the font work. So there are things like font names that exist in a font, and there's different names for, say, different applications. Like Microsoft Word has sort of just a single font family menu, and then within each font family, you might hit like Command I or Command B to make it italic or bold.
Yeah.
Whereas in something like TextEdit on Mac or Figma, you select the family and then the style name. So those exist as their own sort of separate data entries within a font. There's also things like declaring whether a font is the italic version or the bold version, what Unicode ranges are there. Unicode assigns a specific kind of number value to every character in most languages that are commonly used. And so, yeah, a font has a whole table for saying like, the Unicode number for lowercase Latin A is represented by this outline, this glyph, or almost like if you were making it in a website, it would be this SVG sort of is the letter A. But that's a weird metaphor in that that's not how a font file is arranged exactly, unless it's an SVG font. But I don't know. I sometimes get off track.
No, it's okay. We like a rambly answer, honestly.
Yeah, honestly, looking at the site you mentioned, variablefonts.io, I think like there's an animation right now where like every letter is getting wider and fatter, and so I'm guessing that the way we've defined this thing is we've defined like how much wider can it get. So like without variable, you potentially would have just like weight 300, 400, 900, but I guess with variable, do you have weights in between that you can do basically?
Correct. Yeah, okay. Exactly. To get back on the track I was trying to answer is like the reason variable fonts exist is they've got lots of information that describes the font, not just the shapes. And so you can actually pack the shape information and that sort of interpolation weight range information, for instance, or stylistic range information into a single font file. And you can make it a compressed file in a way that saves data. So if you're using usually more than 2 or 3 styles on a website, using the variable font instead, if it exists, will usually start to save some kilobytes of data. Nice. If you had a website that was using many styles, like 15 or 20, then variable fonts would save you quite a lot of data and maybe start to actually impact page load time and such. So Google Fonts is one place that's like been really pretty instrumental in moving forward variable fonts because as you can imagine, they're serving like many millions of files, I guess billions of font files. And so I don't know the math that they've used, but they, I suppose, looked at the numbers and said like, oh, if we shaved off X% of file size, we could save X number of dollars. And that made it worth investing in. But as a designer, I just love the idea that like, oh, I can do more with a font file. I can animate it, or I can create something that somebody could animate. So like a thing I always love as an idea in a font is like, what if the font weight changed on hover and that kind of added another element to sort of hint to somebody that they could click a link, say, or a button.
Nice. And I guess you could animate that with keyframes too, like animate the...
for sure.
That's cool.
Yeah, because people used to do that, but it was just going from bold to not bold. And there's no animation there. There's no transition there.
Yeah, I love a good micro transition. And so to toot my own horn a little bit, the initial animation that says invariably interesting on this variablefonts.io page is kind of my first major font project. It's called Recursive.
Oh, nice.
And I was working at that during that MA program I did for font design. And then I came out of that and started doing font development for Google Fonts, kind of shepherding fonts from design phase to production phase. And they found out about my variable font project and said like, oh, hey, do you want to actually like finish that and publish it as an open source project? So yeah, I was really lucky to have some support in actually like doing the many hours of work it takes to like go from essentially a prototype to something that's usable by a lot of people.
Yeah, and your recursive demos are really cool. The recursive.design site has a lot of like,
thank you,
really incredible demos. Is that stuff that you coded yourself?
No, that I did have a definite hand in it, but there was a team of people I was working with to come up with the visual design for that website and code the website itself. Wow. So yeah, it was really great to have like various people like coming up together with how you could demonstrate the kind of purpose behind these things. I had a lot of ideas in mind, but how do you like actually show the idea of a hover style being different on this font versus another font?
Yeah.
Or like, how do you show what a casual axis is? Because that was kind of something invented for this font project or this typeface.
If you're out there and you really want to get a good handle beyond the variablefonts.io, this recursive.design, the little sliders you can play with to really see exactly how the font changes as it gets more mono, as it gets more casual, as it gets like, man, it's just so cool and it's so interactive. So folks of you out there who are looking for really neat interactive inspiration and just to see how this stuff works, it's really pretty incredible to take a look at. It all seems extremely complex given that there's so many different variables at play here. Are variable fonts harder to design, or are the different stepped versions harder to design? I guess develop or design as well. Yeah.
So I do kind of split the idea of making fonts into a design and a development set of processes. There's obviously like a lot of blurriness there in any sort of a project between design and development. In terms of a font, I think of design as drawing the letters, making sure they have the right amount of spacing between them to look like they have an even amount of spacing in any combination. That includes a phase called kerning, which is kind of introducing little pair-specific spacing adjustments for a font. And then there's the development side, which is using often command line tools to say like build from the source file where you've drawn things to an output binary file like a .otf or .ttf font. For a long time before variable fonts were like publicly usable in their current iteration on the web, font designers had started to use interpolation to design typefaces. I'm not perfect on the history of it, but for instance, I believe it's a Matthew Carter font that was made in like 1991 for the Mac platform. And it's kind of got like a Greek font look to it, but that was a super early version of essentially variable fonts called multiple masters. And it was this idea of using interpolation to allow a user to dial in the weight across or the width they desired for a font. So yeah, really since like the early 90s, literally people have been designing fonts with interpolation as a process that allowed them to say, draw a regular and a black weight and then interpolate the weights in between from there. For a long time, they would do sort of a secondary process or many secondary processes to like generate those intermediate weights as new sources and then, I don't know, fix things up as they went. Like when you're interpolating to lowercase a's, if depending how you've drawn it, you might get kinks in the outlines just based on how the math of linear interpolation between two shapes works. And so you might go in and fix those. So yeah, there's kind of a lot of like techniques to understand to design a variable font where outlines scale fluidly without kinks. And that's the major difference, I guess. You also have to know a few things to be able to draw a glyph with the exact same number and order of points so that font interpolation will smoothly or be able to at all interpolate between those two shapes.
Mm.
So there's like, yeah, it's harder in some ways, but people designing fonts before variable fonts had, deep expertise, of course, as well.
Yeah, talk about deep expertise. I just looked at Matthew Carter's Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
This guy's got all the hits. Georgia,
Definitely.
Helvetica. Man, this is like basically the
He's
listing
kind
of all
of
the
worked on
default fonts.
everything. Yeah.
Wild.
He's kind of the Tony Hawk of the
Yeah.
font world, I guess. He's also, he's a bit of a rare case in that he's kind of worked in basically every major technology of fonts.
Really?
Like literally, back in the 1450s, Gutenberg invented, well, our sort of current iteration of movable type, where you cut the letter out of a piece of steel and then you use that to like hammer into, I think, a piece of copper or brass. And then you filled that with lead, and that was what created a piece of a font. And then you'd arrange it and print it by stamping paper on it. So Matthew Carter grew up, and I think his dad maybe was a punch cutter. And so Matthew Carter like learned how to design type by cutting it into steel. I could be getting the history wrong, but then like after that, he moved into this whole period of phototype design, where they were doing more of a film-like process for like shining light through a clear piece of plastic with the letters on it. And there were various like technical differences to drawing a font for that. That Matthew Carter pioneered, and then he kind of moved into this digital font era, and today he's making variable fonts. So yeah, he's a pretty cool guy, and yeah.
I need to read just My Type again. It's like a book about history.
A great intro.
Yeah, I read it like 2011 or whenever it came out. I forget, and
Nice.
It's definitely one of those ones. It's if you're out there and you want to learn some typography history, it's a wild book.
That's a fun one. Yeah, it just kind of tells the stories behind fonts like Comic Sans and Papyrus, and I guess I only remember the meme fonts right now.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Several others that are maybe more highbrow.
Yeah, for sure. I noticed that in the recursive blog that you had, like hand painted some of the letters.
Yeah.
Is that process typical, or is that just like a creative exploration? Is that something you chose to do for that one specifically?
So there's this whole like lineage and history of sign painting in the US and other countries. And the first place I would say that I kind of learned about this was from a type company called House Industries, and they've made incredible projects. Like I think their biggest hit is Intricacies, which everyone's seen. I guess like the Shake Shack logo uses Intricacies. It's got like some pretty wonky proportions, but it's like really geometric and beautiful and fun. Ken Barber is a main designer at House Industries, and he's done like incredible hand lettering over the years, lots of custom logos and things. And a style he frequently kind of riffs on is called like casual single stroke lettering. There's sort of various names for it. So that was something that I really enjoyed, like exploring, drawing casual lettering with a pencil, and then it's pretty hard to like turn into vectors because of how fluid and sort of not straight all of those shapes are. But it's really designed to be like kind of the easiest thing to hand paint well for a sign painting project. So there's a lot of hand painted signs in a city like New York where I live, or kind of any big city, that if you start to learn to identify single stroke casual sign painting, you will still see it.
Yeah.
I had a couple of classmates, and one in particular, who were like very good at this. They literally were sign painters. And one in particular, Jen Ramirez, is like one of the best type designers I know. He grew up sort of almost a Matthew Carter story, maybe. He grew up in Mexico. I think his family was like sign painters. And so he was sign painting from like, probably being a very little kid. And he's so good at it. It's gorgeous seeing him work. And so I was kind of there in The Hague studying type design, and we all had to come up with thesis projects and lots of inspiration around. But I was kind of experimenting with brush painting signage, and like I love working with a brush pen to kind of draw that at small scale. And so I started doodling, like, what if a casual single stroke format was taken into like a monospace style of design?
Cool. Yeah.
And I love the sort of distortions that go into monospace fonts. Like, of course, they're monospace. Most fonts give a different amount of width to a skinny letter like I or lowercase l than they would to a wide letter like M or W, where there's more strokes and you need more space. But of course, in a monospace font, the I is usually given like a bottom serif and maybe a top serif, and the M and W are scrunched into like just as little of space as the normally narrow I. And so there's all these kind of things that happen to make a font be monospace. And so I, kind of crunched these two ideas together and started to explore what if there was this casual style sign painting in a monospace sort of pattern. And I tried coding with that pretty early on. I was coding little web demos and things and realized that for me, actually having too much flavor, I might call it, or like too much decoration in a monospace font made it really hard to think. I'm CJ, earlier you said you're like a developer with a bit of design. I'm kind of a designer with a bit of development, and a lot more since then, but still, I'm not like fluent in React or something. So like being able to think clearly when I'm looking at some code is not something that comes for free to me, maybe. So I thought, okay, I have to clearly strip this back a little bit. And that made me think like, well, what I want is more akin to maybe like an SF mono type of design where things are somewhat geometric, but maybe the sides are flat and give a lot of space around letters and make things really crisp and clear. And then, what if I like create a variable axis to interpolate between this like linear, very clear thing to a more casual, more brushy expression. And that is kind of the core idea behind the Recursive project.
Wow, that's so cool. You could definitely see the brush influence in the more casual access of that. I like never thought about that until you just said that. But I have a buddy who does sign painting in Detroit. He did cool. like Shinolas and a bunch of other like record companies and stuff. So I always I follow him and I always see
that stuff is magical. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's super cool.
So cool.
Yeah.
But it makes so much sense that you say that. It looks great. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. You were talking about finding the balance of like a mono font for coding. So some of the stuff I've seen before are monospace fonts that are also like dyslexic friendly. And
sure.
Because I guess with dyslexia, if the characters look slightly different, then it's easier for someone with dyslexia to not skip over those letters and they can like read it more. Have you had experience making a dyslexic friendly font, or is that ever a consideration you make when you're working on fonts?
Yeah, thanks. Dyslexia fonts are like fonts intended to help with dyslexia are one, like a really cool field. Two, a lot of the time, like type designers will sort of question how much scientific rigor is put into those projects. A lot of the time there's just not like, a scientific study done at a large scale saying like, does this actually help on average people with dyslexia to read? But I, on the other hand, like there are people with dyslexia who say like, I prefer reading this font and it works for me. And so that's really cool when it does. My biggest experience with that is that in 2020, I was approached by an incredible artist named Chantel Martin to make a font based on her handwriting. And she is dyslexic. And the way she writes letters is like something she uses in her art a lot. She does these really cool, like large scale, often murals where she takes usually a black marker on a white background and just kind of has this like free form approach, like wandering line. She'll write words that like kind of come into her head. And she draws like little motifs, like kind of stick people in a specific way or different like sailboats, mountains. Just like really thought-provoking, simple, beautiful, cool artwork. So she asked me like, what might you do if I told you to make a new Comic Sans? And I was like, well, first of all, that's like the most incredible brief because people hate this font. So it's clearly a great font. And we worked together. I asked her to kind of, write some pangrams, essentially, write other glyphs or other symbols that would appear in a font. She doesn't write in lowercase as much in her artwork, or actually, from what I understand, her day-to-day writing, but she also wrote the lowercase. She has some like really neat attributes to her writing. I think partly motivated by like developing writing that she could find like distinct between different letters. When you look at something like Helvetica, like there's a lot of, it's kind of the I think maybe a lot of people have this experience, like when you're a kid and learning letters, you're taught a shape of an A, and then you like some point a book comes along with the shape of an A that's like too fancy, and you're like, I was lied to. This isn't an A. And yeah, like there's a lot of little instances where fonts, because of their history, use shapes of letters that maybe aren't the most approachable or recognizable or differentiated. And there's kind of like, I don't know, it all comes down to maybe philosophy and personal preference. In the end, like I think once you're familiar with the double story A and the double story G, they are more distinguishable from the single story versions. But that's just my like preference and experience that goes into thinking that way. I worked with Chantel to make sort of a new Comic Sans that was a variable font project. We did some really fun, like exploratory axes, kind of geared towards maybe animation or playfulness, or giving people the opportunity to get some of the like good vibes from Chantel's artwork into something like a website or a video or a flyer or whatever they wanted to make. And so, yeah, and I haven't gotten a lot of feedback from like people with dyslexia using the font, but it's definitely like in that range. We did the things that we did to make sure letters were differentiated, you know, putting crossbars on the capital I, making sure the one has a flag. The like U doesn't have a tail, for instance, so it can't really be as confused with the N. Lots of little touches like that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Tried to make it.
Yeah. I actually have dyslexia.
Okay.
And I can say from experience, you know, I wasn't sure quite how much of that was like bunk science either.
Right. Yeah.
But
What's your take on
recently,
that?
yeah, Claude AI, the Claude LLM, they have one of their 3 fonts is a dyslexic friendly font.
Okay.
What is it? Let's see. It's just named dyslexic friendly. It does not even have a name.
Oh, interesting.
I would love to know what this is, but either way, it's like kind of weighted heavier towards the bottom of every character. And I will say, I've never tried a dyslexic friendly font in my entire life until this, and I could much easierly read it, and I've kept it.
That's great. Okay.
It's the only one that I've ever
see, yeah.
tried and noticed. Yeah.
I forget. I definitely recognize this kind of general type of font. I think there's a font called something like Dyslexia Pro or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It seems like they maybe have adapted that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into typography for the web for a little bit
Sure.
before we run out of time here. So one thing that I think is pretty obvious is that when you get into like type designers' websites, they all look awesome. Typographists, type designers seem to just have a different handle on design. And it's got to be just because type makes up such a huge part of our design.
Because we're using the best fonts.
Yeah, you're using the best fonts. That's it. Do you have any like 80-20 kind of like what are the small things that people can do to make their typography better on their website?
Yeah, I mean the easy answer is if you use a font from ArrowType, it's gonna elevate the game.
Yes.
Right out of the gate.
I am using name mono in my slides for my talk in Amsterdam in a couple weeks.
That's
so
incredible.
Yes. Yeah,
I'm really honored by that. That's really cool.
Nice.
Well, there you go. You got the 80-20 solved.
Yes.
Right there. I mean, I think that the number one thing that it's just kind of graphic design, typography rules that you learn. Like just clear hierarchy is probably like the single biggest thing. You want to kind of think about like, what's the appropriate amount of size for the body copy? And like often for the web, that's maybe 14 pixels ish, maybe 16 pixels. Maybe if it's just an article, you could bump it up a little further. And you definitely want to have enough line spacing between those. You want your columns of text to not be too wide. there's a lot of rules, I think, for designing books that if you read a kind of slightly more traditional typography guide, like the Elements of Typography, it'll give you rules like, oh, you should never use more than 55 characters for a column of text as a general guideline. That's pretty tight. I think that if you if you look around the web, you'll just kind of see that things I think are more around like 75 characters to 85 characters probably. This is somewhat of a guess, like trying to remember way back. But starting with that body size and like making it appropriate for like a wide variety of screens and probably flexing it a bit between, say, desktop and mobile is a really good place to start. And then trying to make sure that your other elements like have a clear separation from that in a good hierarchical sense. So I guess a simple way to say it is like observe closely how font sizes are related and how margins are used and how much spacing is between lines on something like Notion or Medium, or like if you see a site that looks good, copy what's working. It takes time to kind of gain a sense of what that is, maybe.
Yeah. How do you feel about like a type scale calculation? So I recently made a fluid type scale app for myself. And so a lot of these use like a ratio, and some of them do it in like musical scales, right? Like a perfect fourth or a major third. But like, so what they'll do is take a font size, they'll start at a base size and then multiply it by, 5/4 5/4, whatever that is.
You have a bunch of like floating point numbers for font sizes.
Yeah. How do you feel about that type of math to go into it? Do you think that's like a good strategy? I would love to get your eyes on my type calculator sometime.
I feel like there are things that I love and then things that I am sort of like, I don't think it's necessarily worth it. So, and that's influenced by my kind of history, I guess. I was at IBM when they kind of like revised their whole design system approach, and I liked what they were doing a lot, and it kind of coincided with other recommendations I'd heard that are just so helpful. So like the number one technique I ever learned for visual design is it's helpful to work in units of 16 or 8. So I think the best approach to a basic font scale is just working in rems as much as possible, so that the root M of your website, make your body size 1 rem, and maybe that's 16 pixels or maybe that's 14 pixels. And then if you almost as much as possible base everything on that base unit, it becomes kind of easy. Like you just say like, oh, I've got a headline. I don't know, how does 3 rems look? And if it's too big, so things are overflowing to a egregious amount, maybe you scale it back to 2.5. But working in those rems makes it really convenient, because then you don't have to think like, oh, what's a scale where I'm using musical notation to like go from my base size. It's just like, if you work in rems and units of like 0.25 rem, then it's going to work really nicely. And of course, like there's reasons to use other units. I'd say that like, your max margin, or sorry, your max column width as you're designing a responsive website, like that maybe starts to become a bit impractical or like silly to work in rems all the time for things like viewport sizes, or when you're constraining columns. But for a type scale, definitely just working in rems is great. And so, I think one thing that's kind of akin to that I am a big fan of is using a fluid type scale. So I forget what the technique is called right now. It's like a fluid type scale with gates kind of on either side.
Yeah.
I know there's a CSS. Yeah, the clamp.
Yeah. So you clamp, like, so for instance, mine for the base font size would be 1 rem, comma, and then the ideal one is the middle value. And you calculate that by calculating the slope of the line. And it's like some weird math. I had to do linear algebra to get that value. And then the upper value is what? Like for me, it's 24 pixels for the base font size, which might even be a bit big. So like 1.38 rem. So either way, you get the two ends, like you said, and you do some linear algebra to get the middle value.
That is the kind of thing that I would normally look at and say like, that is silly and not worth the trouble. But I think that is the one thing that I am a big fan of, and I feel like is probably worth the trouble, because if you think about it, like when you're looking at a phone, it's usually kind of close to your face, like a foot and a half away, maybe. And it's a limited screen space. So it makes sense that your base font size for body copies got to be kind of small, like, I don't know, 12 to 14 pixels probably. Like if you look at the size of a font that's used in your text messaging, that's usually a pretty small font size. And yet it's pretty okay for most people. And usually maybe a website will be a bit bigger. But then if you're like sitting 3 feet away from a desktop screen, it's pretty natural. And you've got a lot more space often. It makes sense to bump it up a lot more, maybe even to 24 pixels, you know, to kind of give people the ability to sort of sit back and enjoy the website. And I think it makes sense to scale fluidly between those if it's feasible. I'm sure like getting up to like a production system on a really sprawling website or like a big enterprise website, that could be a huge lift and a lot harder. Depends.
So we talked about some of the things we should do on a site, and I guess we're kind of getting into things we shouldn't do, or things you don't prefer doing. So what are some of your biggest pet peeves when it comes to web type? And what are some things we shouldn't do? Some things maybe you've come across that you hate every time you see it?
So I guess a good answer is like it's really easy on the web, unfortunately, to run into instances that I would call like faux bolding or faux italics. And so kind of training yourself to understand how to recognize that is a useful thing. And it's something that I even, still walk into definitely some of the time because you don't necessarily expect it.
And to be clear, that's for the audience who might not know.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
That's if you are bolding a font that you're loading that doesn't have a bold variant or it's not a variable font. And so the browser is like just like chunking onto it however it wants to,
And then same, with a faux italic. So like for a faux bold, the browser essentially, I think, sort of duplicates the shapes and moves them over by a little bit, and that makes it wider. Maybe they're adding a little bit of an outer stroke to that kind of combination as well. So things just kind of look a little like blobby and blurry and not as good as they would if you're using like a dedicated bold style. Because when a font designer is making a bold style, they end up adjusting a lot of the specific contrast of the strokes that make up a letter. If you look at like a low contrast letter A in like maybe the regular weight of SF Pro or Inter or something easily available, you'll see like the strokes are almost exactly the same width all around, horizontal, vertical. But if you look at the bold or especially like the black version of that font, you'll notice that like the horizontal strokes are noticeably thinner. And that's just because we have to preserve some white space there to make it a recognizable letter.
Wow.
But if something's faux bolded, then it kind of starts to erode that like recognizability. And that's maybe the real reason not to do it, aside from it just not looking as nice. And then faux italics are similar, where an italic font is like very carefully made and considered by type designers. We like to complain about it usually because a lot of effort is put into like, we don't just like click a button to slant everything. If you slant the letter O, maybe the upright version looks nicely like elliptical or round, but if you just hit it with a skew transformation, it kind of looks pointy in the upper right hand and lower left hand corners and then too flat in the opposite corners. So there's a lot of correction going into that. But if it's faux italicized, then you just kind of get the like shapes that the type designer maybe didn't intend.
Yeah, it's a slap in the face to a type designer.
You wouldn't italicize the Mona Lisa. You know?
Yes, perfect. That's a great little. You wouldn't steal a car commercial. Do you have any favorite like type tools that you use that are like maybe web based?
Yeah, like for identifying type on the web, you mean,
or just in general? Like it could be like something to create type stacks or just work with type in general.
Sure. I guess as a font designer, the tools I tend to end up using a lot are tools that I use to like quickly check how a font looks and works. So a really great example of that is called Wacom Fondue, specifically the beta version. So Roel Nieskens is a developer who's like done a lot of really great blogging about font use on the web. In fact, he's got a really good article I should mention about like using variable fonts when you want more control. And like there's a specific problem with the CSS cascade when working with variable fonts. So I don't know if y'all do like notes with show links.
Yeah. In fact,
show
as
notes with
you
links.
talk, we've been pasting them in here.
Cool. Okay.
When it's Wes and I fight to see who can get it in first, and it seems like
amazing.
CJ's just kind of taking that up because he got this one in before me.
Good job. Well, there's a specific blog post that I should mention called "Boiling Eggs." Something CSS cascade, and it's by Pixel Unboxed, and that's just Roll's like screen name. But it's a really great look at like one kind of a bit akin to like those specialized CSS techniques like the clamp scale or something, where if you really want to control variable fonts, that's the way that I've found most useful to do it. Although a lot of the things work without you having to think about it too hard, which is also really nice and a huge advantage. Yet again, I've derailed my train of thought.
No, hey, it's all good. Let's actually get in here to prevent you from derailing. We have 3 rapid fire questions here.
Excellent. All right.
These are supper club questions. So first one, how do you feel about ligatures in coding fonts?
Ooh, nice. I was considering whether to go to the trouble of making ligatures in recursive back when I was starting to design that project. And I, at that point, ran a Twitter poll and like asked people to reshare it, please. Kind of with the options like, I hate them, I won't code without them, or never heard of them. Some sort of spread of options like that. And at least at that time, maybe they were more in vogue. But 25% of something like 750 respondents said like, I wouldn't code without them. So I was like, perfect. All right, I'm going to add them as an option to recursive. Personally, like, I sort of think of them as a bit like a syntax theming kind of option. I do think that they can, the thing that as a maybe intermediate coder that I often wonder is like, am I getting this equal to or less than symbol in the right order or the wrong order? And so that is my very favorite coding ligature, just that like converts like greater than or equal to, and less than or equal to.
I like that too.
Into the like more handwritten looking version. I've definitely heard good and bad arguments against code ligatures. If you want an article that's like I strongly disagree with, but it's by an otherwise wonderful person, Matthew Butterick's rant against coding ligatures is a pretty fun read. And his main exception is that they kind of destroy the point of Unicode, which is to assign a specific character that a user types with the character that's represented on the screen. And code ligatures very specifically, most of the time, like totally kind of override that with a different shape. And so that's kind of like maybe philosophically not a thing that he likes. So what I kind of come down to thinking is if you're creating web tutorials or a demo code for a conference, code ligatures are in fact a bad idea because somebody would have a hard time typing what you've shown them. And so like in that case, I think they're a terrible idea. But if you're coding on your own, they're kind of a nice adaptive technology, I would say. So I'm kind of a fan in that capacity if the font you like happens to have them.
You know what MDIO does for their ligatures is they like don't actually combine the shapes. They just adjust how it looks, you know? So that way it's not like creating an entirely new shape from it.
Yeah, I think that's a nice approach. It's also a little like my insider baseball take on that is that it's a smart way to approach it because if you take the Fira code approach where you've like really changed the shape of things, or I did this in recursive, you can never like actually support every conceivable ligature that somebody might want. And Fira code is always going to have more ligatures than you. So in a way, it's pretty smart as a font design choice to say like, I'll improve the spacing of these symbols that happen a lot, but I won't change the shape so that they look better, but in a subtle way that like doesn't make people feel left out, I guess.
Yeah, and I never used ligatures, and I mean I didn't have a reason for it, but now I think that's my reason is I show code and teach code a lot, so I want people to be able to see the things that I'm typing.
I think in that case, MDIO is a really good compromise because it does like subtly improve the overall shaping, and it kind of like, you know, the double bar, the or kind of symbol there that looks a little better if the bars are scooched together, or like HTTPS // looks better if the / is like kind of kerned a little bit together. Yeah. So in that case, like code ligatures can be a nice thing, but if it changes the representation entirely, I can definitely imagine people being confused following a web tutorial. How do I type the huge greater than or equal to sign? You know?
Yeah. Where's that on my keyboard?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So the coding font I use is called Anonymous Pro. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
I feel like I have, but who's it by?
I should have looked that up before this.
Sorry.
Mark Simonson.
Mark Simonson. Okay, yeah.
You got it.
He's one of my heroes and initial inspirations.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is there a coding font that you use or you prefer?
Yeah. My current font is Name Mono. It's kind of one of the main 5 typefaces that I've published and are things that I'm like continually working to improve. So I use that font so I can kind of get understanding of like what's working and what's not, or what could be improved further. Yeah, but I've also designed it in ways that like suit my preferences and like aesthetic sensibilities.
It looks good. Looks really good.
Thank you. Yeah. That one is based on name sans, which is in turn based on the name tile mosaics of the New York subway system. And so it's like very near and dear to my heart because being a kind of immigrant to New York or from South Dakota, you know, I was like totally captured by these mosaics in the subway system. And it's a city with like a lot of highs and lows, but that is one of the like beautiful parts of it for sure to me.
Yeah, I'm working on an app for my dance practice stuff, and also rooted in New York. I decided to have I have different categories. I decided to make those categories like a bee with the circle in it, a green background, the train stops. But maybe name sans might be a good option there because I'm just using literally whatever. I think I'm using system font for that.
Well, take a look.
Yeah, in that regard, last rapid fire question. What is your favorite font of all time?
Oh, geez. I think that whenever you have something that you love and work on all the time, having a favorite is almost impossible, I guess. So yeah, I don't actually have a good answer to that. I think there's a few fonts that are really inspirational to me. And that's kind of that's where my head's at. And
would you like to share what those are?
Sure. I mean, a recent thing that's verging on a sick pick is Dash by Typotech, and Petra D is I can't really pronounce their last name, but they're Petra D on Instagram. That's a super cool font. That's like a handwriting font, kind of like monolinear approach. Petra D is another person who inspired my explorations in recursive, and then Typotech is a foundry I really look up to. They make incredible work. Yeah, so that's a font I really like. Yeah, I guess Sewn from Klim Type Foundry is like a font I maybe wish I had made or something. It's just like a really beautiful revival of accidens or really standard sans as used in the Vignelli signage for the New York subway system.
Yeah.
So that's a nice project, and Klim does probably the best job of anyone of communicating the story behind a font and the design around the fonts. So that's really beautiful stuff. ArrowType has been a big inspiration. They make mini sites for each of their projects that are really fun and cool.
Who is that?
ArrowType. They made GT America, for instance, GTSD.
Yeah.
They've got some good ones there. There's so many. I don't know. Oh no, Typeco. If you know fonts, you already know them, but every one of their fonts is so creative and wonderful. So
yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, that's it for the rapid fire questions. Let's get into sick picks and shameless plugs. Did you come prepared with a sick pick and shameless plug?
I guess my sick pick, a couple of books that I've enjoyed. So one, I don't read as much as I want to, but a sci-fi book that was wonderful. It's called Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And it's about another planet where there is a super advanced species of spider. And so
Wow.
like they're like a highly evolved civilization of spiders. And that's such a wild concept, but it's a really beautifully written book and yet pretty accessible. So it's a fun read or a fun audible listen in my case.
Cool.
The other book that I really appreciate in a totally different light is NYT Cooking has a recipe book called No Recipe Recipes. And they've kind of like collected a bunch of recipes that are easy to make and kind of easy to, kind of fudge a little bit. So they don't include the exact like 1 teaspoon of this, 1 gram of that, 1 tablespoon of this. It's more of a paragraph of text where it says like, put salmon in the oven at 450 degrees for 12 minutes and it'll be good.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Shameless plug, name Mono. Please check it out. I have free trials of my fonts on my website. I also make fonts for brands and graphic design. If you want to, hit that 80-20 rule of making your font or making your website look good, check out Indie Foundries. There's some really amazing stuff, and it's a little more original than just like blasting out whatever has 10 billion uses on Google Fonts or whatnot.
Yeah, you're throwing Poppins on it and calling it a day.
Google Fonts is very wonderful, and I appreciate them a lot too, of course.
Oh yeah, but there was a specific time when there was like 12 fonts on Google Fonts, and because of that, everybody had Lobster on their website. It was the that period of time. You should also check out Stephen's YouTube channel. It's at ArrowType on YouTube.
Yeah, there I drew a lot of the drawing process of fonts and just kind of share it.
Yeah.
Before the show, I saw your short on why you shouldn't just skew a font to make it italic, and you kind of talked about that. So yeah, definitely
I did.
check
Yeah,
that
if you want a visual for that, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Nice.
Sick.
And I think in general, the process of making fonts, you kind of detail that here. You have like hour-long videos where you're kind of just building fonts as well, right?
Yep. Don't have enough time to make shorter videos, but
no, I mean, it's cool to see the process.
I love watching YouTube skateboarding where it's just people like practicing skateboarding in a park or something. And so my thought is like, well, if I'm making fonts, so I might as well like share snippets of it when I'm doing something that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
it's super good. Yeah. Yeah. Give Stephen a follow in all the places. Check out ArrowType. Again, I'm using name Mono. Name Sans looks great. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. It's been a blast. Yeah. Thank you for answering our dumb questions about typography. All right. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.